and get started here. So in this second part of chapter 4, what we're really looking at is sort of putting the different pieces of the puzzle together that we've discussed so far. So we have talked about the membrane. We've talked about properties of the membrane, the cell membrane, the phospholipids that make up the cell membrane. We've also talked about the driving forces that influence the way that particles move across the membrane. What we're going to get into in this second part is really how we can influence the movement. We're going to talk about the 3 different types of movement. So simple diffusion, we're going to talk about facilitated diffusion, we're going to talk about channels. So these are the different ways that we can move particles across the membrane, whether it be done passively by diffusion, or we can have the inclusion of channels or transporters in the membrane that can help to move some particles through. So that's going to be the basis of what we discuss as far as objective 1. Objective 2 is going to get more into permeability. So the permeability is how easily something can get through the membrane, and that is going to influence how the rate of transport happens, how fast those things can get through the membrane. And we're going to talk about different things that will affect the permeability. All right, so let's first describe what the rate of transport is, and let's talk about the end goal of transport. So transport is happening in a way that is trying to approach what we refer to as the diffusional equilibrium. Diffusional equilibrium is when there is no more net transfer of molecules. Okay, so let's say in this first panel in this schematic, we've got side 1, which has 1 mole of particles dissolved. We've got side 2 also has 1 mole of particles. We can think about movement that's happening from side 1 to side 2, right? We can think about this as being a one-way flux of particles. And then there's also movement happening from side 2 to side 1. Okay, but notice that there is no net movement. There is no net accumulation on either side because we have an equal concentration on both sides and there's no concentration gradient. So there's no force that's, there's no chemical driving force or concentration gradient to result in a net flux from one side to the other. Right, and so this is going to be the end goal of particles moving. They're going to move to honor that concentration gradient, but whenever the concentration gradient has evened out, there's going to be no more net movement, and we're going to consider this diffusional equilibrium. Let's take a different scenario. Let's say that there were different particle concentrations. So in side 1, we have 2 moles, so it's twice the amount of side 2, which has 1 mole. So here we definitely have a concentration gradient. And while we are still seeing net flux of particles, while we are still seeing one-way flux of particles from side 2 to side 1, which is really large because it's a larger concentration gradient, we're also seeing one-way flux of particles from side 2 to side 1. What this means is although there's a concentration gradient in favor of side 1 to side 2, some particles can still move in the opposite direction because we have a freely permeable membrane. When we talk about the net flux, this is the direction of the majority of particles moving. This is the direction of the accumulation of particles. So we're going to have more particles moving from side 1 to side 2, and that will be the direction of our net flux. What is the overall accumulation of particles or movement of particles? Okay. So the 2 scenarios that we described here are to show us, 1, how particles are moving in both directions individually, but that is leading to a net flux in one direction or the other. And then the second scenario is showing us what the ultimate end goal of movement is. So transport is happening in order for particles to reach their diffusional equilibrium, at which state there is no longer any net flux to any one side or the other. All right. So let's further describe the passive transport that is required for moving some of these particles. So we describe passive transport versus active transport very loosely in part 1. Here we're actually going to get into the examples of passive transport and some of the factors that can influence passive transport. So passive transport, just to recap, we said is spontaneous. We said that there's no energy required. In fact, there was energy liberated or released. We said that it was downhill. In other words, it's going to be happening down or across or with a concentration gradient. Some of the examples of passive transport that we're going to look at are simple diffusion. And simple diffusion simply means that a particle is moving right through the membrane. There's no transporter, there's no carrier, there's no channel, there's no additional help. There is certain features of the particle which are favorable, one of them being that it is nonpolar, right? We talked about the fact that in order for particles to get through the lipid bilayer, they have to be nonpolar. That and other properties make some particles able to go right through the membrane without any additional help, and we describe that type of movement as simple diffusion. Facilitated diffusion, on the other hand, is where we're going to start to require additional help. In facilitated diffusion, we're going to require transporters. So we talked about certain proteins being embedded in the membrane. If you remember back to the drawing that we made of the cell membrane, and some of the proteins that were embedded in the membrane were described as being transporters. This is where these proteins come into play. They can help to facilitate the movement of particles from one side to the other, and so we're going to call this type of movement facilitated diffusion. The third type of passive transport is going to be diffusion through channels. This is a different type of protein. So this is, again, still going to be a protein, but a different type of protein. It's going to allow for the passage of certain specific molecules, mainly ions, or sometimes water can move right through. And it's also going to require additional help in order to move those particles through. All right. Let's talk about some of the characteristics of simple diffusion first. So if you think back to these 3 examples, we're going to start off with simple diffusion first. We're going to talk about factors that affect that, and then we'll talk about the other 2 types. So simple diffusion, no membrane proteins are required. The particle must be able to go through the lipid bilayer, the phospholipid bilayer. So particles that are big and bulky, or particles that are charged, or particles that are polar, right, that they don't play nicely in that non-polar center of the bilayer. Those are not going to be able to go through the membrane by simple diffusion because they're not going to be able to go right through that phospholipid bilayer. Particles that are small, that are non-charged, that are non-polar will be able to go through that phospholipid bilayer, and so they will be able to move through the membrane by simple diffusion. Some of the factors that affect the rate of simple diffusion, in other words, how fast those particles can move through that lipid bilayer, are the magnitude of the driving force, okay, which we know has a lot to do with the concentration gradient or the chemical driving force. The second is going to be the membrane surface area. How much of that membrane surface exists for those particles to be able to move across? That's going to greatly affect the rate at which particles can move. And then the third one is probably the most important one. It's one that is going to depend on some other variables that we'll talk about coming up, but this is the membrane permeability. This is how easily can these particles move through the membrane. Remember, if a particle cannot move through the membrane, it cannot undergo simple diffusion. And so if we have decreased membrane permeability, it doesn't matter how high our concentration gradient is. It doesn't matter how much surface area we have for transport. If the particle can't get through the membrane, our simple diffusion rate is going to be 0, right? So the membrane permeability is really important at determining how fast, or if at all, particles are able to go through the membrane and are able to move by simple diffusion. All right. Okay, so someone's asking what does CD stand for? That was chemical driving force. chemical driving force, or concentration gradient, right? Two different ways to express the same force. All right, let's look at a drawing here. And again, I'm going to encourage you to draw along with me, but please feel free to stop me if you need me to go slower or if you have questions. But let's look at a few different scenarios that really describe the factors that affect the rate of simple diffusion. Okay, so we're looking at simple diffusion. We're speaking specifically about factors that affect the rate. Okay, so let's list those factors out here, and then we'll look at a few scenarios that illustrate them. So the first factor is the magnitude of the driving force. And in brackets, I'm going to put CDF, which stands for chemical driving force. Okay. The second property or factor that affects the rate of simple diffusion is the permeability of the membrane. Okay, this we said was the most important factor. Okay, and we're going to talk about some other variables that will influence the permeability. But the permeability is basically how, what properties of the membrane or the particle allow for the easy movement of that particle through the membrane. Okay, and we'll talk about some other variables that will affect that, but that's going to be the most important factor that affects the rate of simple diffusion. The third factor is going to be the surface area available for exchange. Sorry, my pen is kind of skipping lines here, so some of these T's may be missing their cross portion. So surface area available for exchange. Okay, surface area available for exchange. In other words, how much membrane is exposed so that particles can actually go across. If we have a small amount of membrane exposed, we're not going to be able to maximize the movement. If we have a large amount of area exposed, we're going to have a faster rate of those particles moving. So let's draw out a few scenarios here. Let's do A. This will be our first scenario. B, be our second scenario here. C, and then D. Oops, this one looks like an egg. Okay, so these are basically cells, right? So cells inside here, they have a membrane. So we're going to have this membrane that's separating two sides. All right. And so we have different concentration of particles on either side. So let's talk about side or scenario A first. So in scenario A, we have 1 mole of particles on side A, or the left side, so 1 mole here, and then 0 moles here. All right. For side B, we have the same thing. We've got 1 moles here and 0 moles here. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the size of cell B. So let's say cell B is now, I apologize if you're having to erase. I should have made this larger from the beginning. Let's say we had a cell in cell B that was twice the size of the cell in scenario A. So now we have a membrane that is 2 times the length of this membrane, right? Our concentration gradient is still going to be the same, 1 mole here and 0 mole here. So what we'll see, we have 1 mole of particles on this side and 0 moles on this side. Here we have the same thing, 1 mole of particles on this side and 0 on this side. Okay, who can tell me which of these two scenarios what the concentration gradient will look like? What's the movement going to be happening? From left to right or right to left? Yeah, perfect. So left to right, right? Because we have a concentration gradient that's favoring the movement of particles from the left side to the right side, just based upon the difference in particles. So in scenario A, we're going to have standard movement of particles here. But notice scenario B, we now have twice the length of the membrane. So we're going to have an even stronger rate of movement of particles across this side, right? So the rate of simple diffusion in scenario B is already twice the rate in scenario A, although the concentration gradient is the exact same, because this third factor comes into play, the amount of surface area available for exchange, right? So let's make a note of that here. Here we have a strong concentration or chemical driving force. So CDF is chemical driving force. We have a strong chemical driving force from left to, from left to right. Okay. Here we have a stronger chemical driving force from left to right. And I'm going to say because we have more surface area exposed. Okay. So the rate of simple diffusion is going to be faster. This is going to be a faster rate of simple diffusion. Okay. Let's take a third scenario into play just to really reemphasize these various features. So let's say in this third cell scenario, we have less of a concentration gradient. Let's say we have 0.8 moles of particles on this side, and then maybe 0.5 on the right side. So not as big of a gradient as we had in these first two scenarios. So we have 0.5 moles on the right. All right. While we still have a chemical driving force, we still have a gradient for diffusion here. It's going to be a weaker chemical driving force because we have a smaller concentration gradient. Okay. So let's illustrate that here. I'm going to express that by just putting a simple, oops, what's happening? Oh no. Okay. I'm going to illustrate that by putting a simple arrow, so not a really big arrow. And down here, we're going to make a note that this is a weaker chemical driving force, right? Also from left to right. okay? Because we have a smaller concentration gradient. As a result, we're going to have a slower rate of simple diffusion. Oops. Okay, a slower rate of simple diffusion. So here we had a faster rate of simple diffusion. Here we have a slower rate of simple diffusion because we have manipulated these three factors, right? We have a smaller magnitude of the driving force because we have a smaller concentration gradient. Therefore, we have a slower rate of simple diffusion, all right? And then in the fourth scenario, I just want to illustrate what the end goal of transport is. So that concept that we talked about, which was diffusional equilibrium, let's illustrate that as well. So let's say we had okay, for some reason I can't change my colors here. It's always something. Okay, let's just go with red. So let's say we had 0.5 moles on this side, 0.5 moles also on this side, so 0.5 moles, 0.5 moles. We don't have a concentration gradient here, right? What do we think the movement is going to look like here? What is the net movement going to look like? Zero, perfect, yes. So there's going to be zero movement, right? Because we have zero concentration gradient, zero magnitude of the driving force. And so this is going to be said to be at diffusional equilibrium. And so I want to illustrate that we have one-way flux going in this direction, one-way flux going in this direction, but we have no net flux, right? No net flux. So although we can still see some particles escaping, right, because the membrane is freely permeable, so we can't really stop particles from trying to move one way to the other, but because there is no driving force, there's no concentration gradient, so there's no chemical driving force, right? We're not going to see any net flux or net accumulation on either side, okay? So the rate of simple diffusion here is equal to 0.